December 1944. The Ardennes, a frozen wasteland where men shivered, bled, and died under a sky heavy with snow. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, Hitler's last desperate gamble to split the Allies, capture Antwerp, and force the Western Front into chaos. But in the freezing forests, amidst shattered villages and burning tanks, a new weapon appeared. A weapon the Germans never expected, a secret the Allies had guarded fiercely. It was called the proximity fuse, a fuse so advanced that General George S. Patton himself said it was the single greatest invention of the war. And here, in the Ardennes, under skies filled with the black wings of the Luftwaffe and forests crawling with German infantry, this invention would turn the tide. Entire German formations would be wiped out in seconds, destroyed not by overwhelming numbers, but by invisible bursts of science and fire. The Germans had expected American artillery. They had not expected this, for instead of shells that buried themselves in the frozen ground before exploding, these new shells burst in the air at the perfect height. Shrapnel rained down with merciless precision, shredding entire companies before they could reach their objectives. Soldiers later described it as if the very sky had turned against them. But to understand why this moment was so shocking, we must go back. Back to a war already dragging into its 6th bloody year. Back to the desperate gamble of Adolf Hitler and the fragile hope of Allied soldiers who would soon discover that science itself might save their lives. Because this is not just the story of artillery, it's the story of men who endured the cold, the fear, and the chaos of the Ardennes. It's the story of German soldiers, marching with confidence into what they thought was another fight, only to face a weapon they couldn't comprehend. And it's the story of how, in the snow-choked forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, the fate of the Western Front hung by a thread until invisible fuses lit the skies with death. Before the proximity fuse unleashed its storm, the Ardennes was a battlefield balanced on the knife's edge of history. And that edge was about to cut deep. By December 1944, the Allies believed victory was close. After the triumph of D-Day, Allied armies had swept across France, liberated Paris, and pushed into Belgium. German forces were retreating on all fronts. Many American soldiers thought the war might be over by Christmas. But Adolf Hitler had other plans. In his mountain retreat, Hitler devised a bold and desperate counterattack. His armies would strike through the Ardennes' dense forests where the Allies least expected a major offensive. The goal: split the American and British forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and shatter Allied morale. It was a gamble, a final roll of the dice from a leader who refused to surrender. On December 16, 1944, the gamble began. 500,000 German troops surged forward, supported by tanks, artillery, and the roar of the Luftwaffe. They smashed into thinly stretched American lines. Entire units were overwhelmed. Towns like Bastogne and St. Vith became names etched in blood and ice. The world held its breath. American GIs, many young and untested, were suddenly thrust into the most brutal winter battle of the war. Supplies were scarce. Ammunition ran low. Temperatures plunged below freezing. One soldier later recalled, "We were fighting two enemies, the Germans and the cold." But while the soldiers fought to hold the line, far behind the front, another secret was being prepared. It was the proximity fuse, a device years ahead of its time. Unlike traditional shells, which exploded on contact or after a timed delay, this new fuse carried a tiny radio transmitter. As the shell approached its target, the signal bounced back. The moment the target was close enough, the fuse detonated, without ever touching the ground. The result? An explosion in mid-air, raining steel down with deadly precision. Developed in secret by American and British scientists, including minds at Johns Hopkins University's Applied Physics Laboratory, the fuse was considered so revolutionary that its existence was one of the Allies' most closely guarded secrets. Churchill himself warned, "This fuse is second only to the atomic bomb in importance." At first it was used cautiously, mainly in naval battles, where the chance of one falling into enemy hands was minimal. The fear was simple: if Germany recovered even a single unexploded shell, they could copy it. But in the forests of the Ardennes, As German troops poured through the snow, the Allies faced annihilation, and desperate times demanded desperate measures. The secret was about to be unleashed on land for the first time. The Germans had the element of surprise, but the Allies had a surprise of their own. And when it came, it would tear entire formations apart. For the men on the ground, the Ardennes was not a map with arrows. It was cold, it was hunger, it was fear. Private Harold K. Johnson of the 106th Infantry Division remembered sitting in his frozen foxhole clutching his rifle. The snow came down so thick you could hardly see, he later wrote. The silence would break with sudden fire, and you never knew if the next artillery round had your name on it. The 106th, newly arrived and inexperienced, bore the brunt of the German surprise attack. Many were encircled, captured, or killed in the first days. For those who survived, every hour felt like borrowed time. On the German side, spirits were different. Soldiers of the 5th Panzer Army, hardened veterans, believed this offensive could change everything. They sang marching songs as they pushed through the snow. One lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We march into destiny. If we can take Bastogne and reach the Meuse, perhaps Germany will live again." But even they felt the bite of winter. Temperatures plunged to 20 below. Frostbite was as dangerous as enemy bullets. German supply lines were stretched, and fuel was scarce. Tanks that could not move were abandoned. For both sides, the forests themselves were a torment. Dense pines muffled sound. The snow hid movement. A squad could vanish into the trees and never be seen again. Soldiers described it as fighting ghosts in a white labyrinth. Amid this misery, artillery became the most feared weapon. Soldiers called barrages the tree bursts. Shells that struck branches above would shower steel down in deadly arcs. Men learned to hug the frozen ground, praying the next explosion would not find them. Yet even in fear, there was humanity. Letters home carried small comforts, a GI scribbling about missing his wife's cooking, a German grenadier dreaming of warm bread and beer. One American wrote to his mother, "Christmas is coming, but I can sit hear carols, only guns. Tell Dad I still be home for the next one, if God wills it." Neither side knew that in just days, artillery would become more than terror. It would become annihilation. The proximity fuse was on its way to the battlefield, a silent promise that the skies themselves would turn against the Germans. In the foxholes of Ardennes, men fought with courage, fear, and hope. They braced for whatever came next. They had no idea that the very nature of war was about to change. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the quiet of the Ardennes shattered. At 5:30 a.m., 1,600 German artillery pieces thundered as one, the largest barrage the Western Front had seen since the First World War. Shells screamed through the trees, exploding in the snow. American positions crumbled. In the fog and chaos, German infantry surged forward behind the armor of Panthers and Tigers. The thinly manned American lines buckled. The 106th Infantry Division, caught in the path of the onslaught, was encircled. 2 entire regiments, over 6,000 men, were forced to surrender. It was the largest mass capitulation of US troops in Europe. Panic rippled through the front. The German advance punched a deep wedge, what would soon be called the Bulge, into Allied lines. Towns fell, bridges were seized. The situation was desperate. Hitler-Sepp's gamble seemed to be working. Allied high command reeled, caught off guard by the ferocity of the assault. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill admitted it was the greatest American battle of the war. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne, short of supplies and outnumbered, was surrounded. General Anthony McAuliffe gave his famous one-word reply to the German demand for surrender: "Nuts." But defiance could not change the cold fact across the Ardennes. The Americans were bleeding, freezing, and holding on by fingernails. In this crisis, artillery became the backbone of resistance. Guns roared day and night, hurling shells into advancing columns. But conventional fuses had limits. Many shells buried themselves harmlessly in the snow before exploding. Others burst too soon or too late, wasting their deadly force. Artillerymen cursed the wasted shots. They needed something more, something that could break up massed attacks with devastating effect. And in the snow-draped hills, that something was waiting. Shipments of the new proximity fuses, labeled simply VT for variable time, had begun to arrive. They had been kept locked away, guarded by secrecy so tight that even most frontline troops had never heard of them. But now, as German infantry gathered for fresh assaults, the order came down: the secret weapon would be unleashed. The Germans believed they had surprise on their side. They believed the forest and the snow gave them cover. But when the shells began to burst above their heads, when the sky itself erupted in fire, they would discover how wrong they were. By the third week of December 1944, the Ardennes was a battlefield of despair. The German offensive had carved deep into Allied lines, creating chaos across Belgium and Luxembourg. Entire towns lay in ruins. Columns of American prisoners trudged east, their faces hollow with shock. Civilians fled through snow-choked roads, caught between the hammer of the Wehrmacht and the anvil of retreating Allied forces. The Germans pressed westward, hungry for the Meuse River. For a moment it seemed possible they might break through entirely, splitting the Allied armies, reaching Antwerp, and altering the course of the war. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower admitted the situation was dire. Reinforcements were rushed from all directions. Patton wheeled his Third Army north in a desperate gamble to relieve Bastogne. But for the men already trapped in the Ardennes, relief felt like a distant dream. One GI remembered, "We ran out of food. We cut up sheets to wrap our feet, because our boots had frozen solid. Some prayed, some cursed. We all wondered how long we could hold." At Bastogne, surrounded and under constant shell fire, the 101st Airborne endured day after day of bombardment. Medical supplies dwindled. Ammunition grew scarce. Wounded men lay shivering in barns converted to makeshift hospitals. Elsewhere, the Germans prepared to unleash new waves of infantry. Thousands massed in the forest, confident that American artillery could not stop them all. Traditional shells often buried themselves harmlessly in snow, or exploded too far from their targets. The Americans were running out of time and options. But then came the order. The secret weapon, kept under lock and key for years, was finally to be used. Artillerymen carefully screwed the strange new fuses into their shells. Many didn't fully understand how they worked. Some were skeptical, but all knew one thing: they had no choice. The next German assault was forming. Columns of infantry were moving into position under the cover of snow and trees. American lines were stretched thin, morale shaken. If the attack broke through, the Ardennes would collapse. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The Germans advanced, unaware of what awaited them. In the American gun pits, the order was given. The first shells armed with proximity fuses were loaded into the breaches. The men held their breath. The moment of truth had come. December 23, 1944. The Ardennes. German infantry moved in dense formations, advancing through the snow under cover of trees. They had done this before, storming trenches, overrunning positions, overwhelming by sheer weight of numbers. But this time, something was different. In the American batteries, the new VT fuses had been fitted. No timer, no guesswork. These shells carried tiny radio transmitters, ready to detonate when they came close to their targets. The guns thundered. Shells screamed into the air, arching above the German advance. And then, the sky exploded. Instead of burying themselves uselessly in the snow, the shells burst overhead in perfect timing. Hundreds of steel fragments sliced downward in wide, lethal cones. Entire squads were shredded in seconds. Helmets, rifles, and bodies were hurled into the drifts. Survivors later said it was as if invisible scythes had swept through their ranks. One German officer, stunned, wrote, "It was as though the heavens themselves were firing upon us." Men tried to throw themselves flat, but there was no safety. The killing zone was all around. Even those lying prone were torn apart by the steel rain. Within minutes, entire formations were broken, columns scattered. American soldiers in their foxholes stared in awe. A young gunner recalled, "We saw them coming thick as ants. Then the shells burst over their heads, and they just disappeared. We sent never seen anything like it. Gun after gun fired, each shell finding its deadly mark without ever striking the ground. The Germans had no defense, no countermeasure, no understanding of what had just struck them. The effect was devastating. Assault after assault melted away under the invisible storm. In some sectors, entire companies were annihilated before they could even reach American lines. The tide of the battle began to shift. For the first time in days, American soldiers felt momentum swing in their favor. The impossible pressure was easing. The secret was out. The proximity fuse had entered the war on land, and its impact was immediate, terrible, and decisive. The Germans had believed they could break through by sheer force of arms. Instead, they met a weapon they could not see, could not stop, and could not survive. The Battle of the Bulge would not be won in that instant, but the course of the fight had changed forever. Once the first shells had burst overhead, the effect was undeniable. The proximity fuse worked, and it worked beyond imagination. In the days that followed, American commanders made a critical decision. The new weapon would no longer be held in reserve. It would be used wherever the fighting was thickest, wherever German attacks threatened to break through. The Ardennes lit up with artillery fire. In sector after sector, proximity-fused shells transformed the battlefield. German infantry moving down roads were torn apart before they even reached the front. Columns trying to cross open ground found themselves shredded from above. Even troops sheltering in shallow foxholes discovered that the sky offered no mercy. Steel fragments rained down at perfect height. A German corporal later recalled, "We tried to hide in ditches, behind trees, anywhere, but the shells seemed to know where we were. Men fell screaming all around me. It was like nothing we had faced before." For American gunners, it was a revelation. A sergeant in the 2nd Armored Division wrote in his diary, "Every round counts now. One shell could take out dozens. We were grinning like fools after the first barrage. We knew we had a fighting chance again." At Bastogne, the besieged 101st Airborne held on under constant German attacks. The arrival of artillery armed with proximity fuses was described as a godsend. Instead of shells wasting themselves in the snow, every burst ripped holes in the enemy's ranks. Even the Luftwaffe felt the sting. When German aircraft flew low over the lines, proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells detonated with uncanny accuracy, turning the skies into lethal traps. What once required dozens of shots now took only a handful. The weapon changed the rhythm of battle. Where once Americans braced for endless waves of German assaults, now those assaults faltered before they could gain momentum. German commanders grew frustrated, bewildered. Reports filtered back, entire battalions cut down in minutes, morale crumbling. But victory was not yet secure. The weather remained brutal, supplies were still scarce, and the Germans continued to fight with desperation, hurling their last reserves forward. Still, the balance had shifted. The proximity fuse was no longer just a secret, it was a force multiplier. It gave American artillery dominance in conditions that had once favored the attacker. With every shell, the tide turned further. The Battle of the Bulge was not over, but its outcome was being rewritten, one detonation at a time. By late December, the German drive was losing momentum. Their timetable was broken. Fuel shortages crippled their tanks. American resistance, once fragile, was stiffening, and everywhere the proximity fuse shattered their infantry formations, draining the Wehrmacht of strength it could not replace. General George S. Patton had wheeled his Third Army with astonishing speed. In just days, his divisions pivoted northward through snow and ice, racing to relieve the surrounded 101st Airborne at Bastogne. The fighting was savage. Roads were clogged with wrecked vehicles and frozen corpses. German artillery pounded relentlessly, but with air support returning as the skies cleared and proximity-fused shells tearing gaps in enemy lines, the Americans pushed forward. On December 26th, the lead elements of Patton's tanks broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. Cheers erupted from exhausted paratroopers who had held out against impossible odds. One soldier wrote, "When we saw those Shermans rolling in, it was like seeing the sun again after endless night." Across the front, the German offensive was collapsing. Their elite divisions, Panzer Lehr, 2nd Panzer, 12th SS Hitlerjugend, had bled themselves dry against unyielding American resistance and devastating artillery barrages. The proximity fuse had done its silent work. Massed infantry attacks, once the backbone of German tactics, had become suicidal. Units disintegrated under steel rain before they could close with the enemy. One US commander later reflected, "Without the VT fuse, I don't know if we could have stopped them. With it, we cut them to pieces." Even Hitler's generals admitted the tide had turned. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overseeing the offensive, warned Berlin, "We have thrown our last dice." By early January 1945, the bulge in the lines was shrinking. American counterattacks, supported by ceaseless artillery, ground the Germans back. The once proud offensive dissolved into a fighting withdrawal. The Ardennes, meant to be Germany's triumph, had become its graveyard. The Battle of the Bulge ended not with a single blow, but with the grinding realization that Germany's last gamble had failed. The Allies had endured the storm. The fuse had given them the edge, and from this moment on, the German army would never again seize the initiative in the West. The reversal was complete. When the guns finally fell silent in January 1945, the Ardennes was a wasteland. Forests stood shattered, villages burned to ashes, and fields were littered with wreckage and frozen dead. The Battle of the Bulge had been the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. Over 600,000 American troops had been engaged. Nearly 90,000 became casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Survivors carried scars far beyond the battlefield. One GI remembered, "I came home alive, but every night I still heard the shells. I still saw the snow turning red." For the Germans, the price was even higher. More than 100,000 casualties, their reserves spent, their tanks abandoned for lack of fuel. Many units that had once been elite were reduced to shadows, never again to recover. A German prisoner told his interrogators, "We thought we had you, but your guns were in the sky. We had no chance." For Belgian and Luxembourg civilians, the Ardennes offensive brought fire and death to their doorsteps. Entire towns were flattened. Thousands were killed in massacres, bombings, or caught in the crossfire. Families who had survived years of occupation now faced winter with nothing but rubble for shelter. Yet amid the devastation, there was also survival. Bastogne, once surrounded, stood free. Allied lines, once fractured, were restored. And from that moment, the war in Western Europe would only march one way toward Germany. But perhaps the greatest revelation was not just in victory, but in what had made it possible. The proximity fuse had proven itself a weapon of unparalleled power. It had multiplied the effectiveness of artillery fivefold. It had broken the back of German assaults that might otherwise have succeeded. General George S. Patton, never one for understatement, declared, "The new fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us." Yet behind the triumph lay moral weight. Each miraculous detonation in the sky had meant death below, men torn apart, formations erased in seconds. It was victory bought with devastation. In war, even salvation is written in blood. The Ardennes would be remembered not only for its suffering, but for the moment when science itself turned the tide. The soldiers who fought there never forgot. Today, the Ardennes is quiet. The forests that once echoed with artillery fire are still. The roads where tanks burned are lined with farms and villages rebuilt from ashes. To walk here now is to feel peace where once there was only chaos. But beneath the soil, history lingers. The Battle of the Bulge remains a scar and a testament, a reminder of what desperation, courage, and innovation can mean in war. The proximity fuse stands as one of the war's great turning points. It was science wielded as a weapon, the marriage of physics and survival. It gave American soldiers a fighting chance when the odds seemed hopeless. It turned the very sky into a shield. General Eisenhower called it one of the three most important inventions of the war. Churchill compared it to the atomic bomb in significance. And for the German soldiers who faced it, it was a nightmare, sudden, invisible, unstoppable. Yet behind the statistics and technology, the story is not about machines. It is about people. The frozen GI in his foxhole, clinging to hope. the German infantryman who never understood what struck him, the Belgian child whose village vanished in flames. They remind us that war is never just strategy. It is human lives, broken and saved, destroyed and defended. The Battle of the Bulge cost nearly 200,000 lives in 6 brutal weeks. It was Germany's last great offensive in the West, and its failure hastened the end of the war. But its legacy is more than military. It teaches us that even in the darkest winter, resilience can endure. That courage is found not in the absence of fear, but in facing it. And that innovation, while powerful, carries a burden, because every weapon reshapes the lives of those it touches. The proximity fuse was not just a tool of victory. It was a reminder that in war, salvation and destruction are two sides of the same coin. As we remember the Ardennes, we honor those who fought, those who suffered, and those who never came home. If this story moved you, like, comment, and subscribe for more echoes of history. Because these voices from the past still have something to teach us, and their echoes must never fade.